You might be asking yourself, has he slept? No. But that's when I get the good ideas. It's also when the voices start. And this time, the voice was Tom Petersen's. And that voice told me there might be a way to expose a limitation with CPU and GPU benchmarking. And that limitation is... Okay, it looks worse than it actually... We have a new benchmark metric that exposes a limitation with current CPU and GPU game testing. This is that limitation. Frames are displayed at an even pace in this example, but something's still wrong with it. The thing that's wrong is why we have the new measurement methodology that we're debuting today. Animation error. Patrick, Andrew, and I have been working on trying to understand this for a little while now, and we finally have an answer. Putting the word animation in the name might be a little confusing. Intel called it simulation time error at one point. And actually, we've been talking about this for over a year now, but we finally have numbers that we understand, we think, that we can start putting in benchmarks and reviews. That we think is really critical here, just to make that extremely transparent. This is a sample chart illustrating what we're talking about, where you can see the animation error timing sometimes in alignment with frame time spikes, sometimes out of alignment with it, showing that it's a different thing. Here's another chart proving that we're not crazy. I mean, showing the percent animation error during a test pass, or this one, where we show the CPU start time versus animation time delta. Now, these are all new types of benchmark charts that we're showing today, and that's kind of the point of this methodology piece. It's an idea that Tom Petersen brought to us over a year ago, and it's something that he started workshopping somewhere around 14 years ago, but it's taken this long to actually get it into an open source tool where anybody can test it. We're gonna show you how to do that at the end of the video as well. The problem with classic GPU, CPU, and even just game benchmarking standalone is that it's always been tough to accurately capture the actual player experience. Frame rate was a good start. It's the bars you normally see, and frame-to-frame interval testing, or frame time testing as it's often called, was a great expansion on that to dig into the problems, but neither perfectly captures the real experience. And so this is what we're unveiling today, the animation error charts and our methodology to it. Consider this a white paper, like a research paper that we're putting out there to the community to poke and prod at, and hopefully this provides a decent foundation for either people to advance testing methodologically and show problems with hardware and games that previously we could kind of guess at informedly, but not actually know, or it will provide a foundation for you to say that we're crazy. Really, either one works. Before that, this video is brought to you by the Height Y70 Touch Infinite. We previously reviewed the Height Y70 non-touch series and found its overall build quality to be good and competitive. Now, the Y70 Touch Infinite ships with a custom 14.9-inch IPS touchscreen with a 60Hz refresh rate. The screen connects to your system build and can be used as a showpiece on the angled corner front panel, displaying stats, music players, videos, and more. Height's entire Y70 series now also includes multiple new colors, like the Taro model that you're seeing here. Learn more at the link in the description below. Massive disclaimer here, none of this is perfect yet. We think it's a good start. If you're a viewer who wants to poke around with this idea, all the tools are available to you online and they're open source. If you're a reviewer and you already have a head start and this is useful for you for information or just to give you a head start on your own work, we'd ask you to please point back to this video because we have invested an enormous amount of time into trying to wrap our heads around this and present it in a way where hopefully at least somebody walks away from this video understanding what the fuck we're trying to say. Because I can tell you it took our team a lot of work for everybody to get on the same page and understand it. That's why there's so many pages here. So if you just point back to us, we'd appreciate it. All right, let's get into it. So the methodological deep dive we're doing today lays the foundation for new testing. This is exploratory and foundational for what we're doing next. We rolled out 1% and 0.1% lows into our charts. That was back in 2014 or so and preceded the popularization of their presentation and bar charts along the average frame rate. These are metrics taken for granted today, but back when I started, they really weren't in charts. It was pretty much just average FPS, and that was about it. There's some people before us who did a lot of work on this. We're going to talk with them in a second. But basically, for the last decade or more, the industry has relied upon 1% and 0.1% bars to point toward a problem. They aren't the problem themselves, and I think this is lost with a lot of the sort of people who are coming up in the space who are new to PC building. But even that doesn't answer the actual reason sometimes that a game just feels bad, but the data doesn't support that it feels bad, and it's not latency either. And that is what we are trying to answer today. Now, the history on that is important. We'll keep it really brief. The people who advanced frame time testing and understanding that metric were Tom Petersen, who is still working on this stuff today, PC Per's Ryan Shrout and Tech Report's Scott Wasson, both of them have left the media side of the business. And Tom in particular did some heavy lifting on providing analysis tools to the media, and today he is working on open source solutions that anybody can use and inspect. Animation error should be thought of in the more traditional sense, like a flip book with perfectly animated drawings, but without execution of flipping through the pages at a constant tempo. Now that's just one specific scenario for animation error. You could extend the metaphor, like flipping through the pages perfectly, but messing up the drawings. Or you can do a combination of both. We're talking about animation in the dictionary sense, quote, a movie scene or sequence that simulates movement from a series of still frames, unquote. So animation error applies to entire frames. Think of it like frames of drawings on an animation lamp, or in a flipbook, or on a reel of film. What we're not talking about is errors in animation of individual models, objects, NPCs, or sprites within the frames. And we're also not talking about games that just have bad animation from the artists. You could technically have animation error just staring at a blank wall in a game without any movement whatsoever, which is part of what makes this confusing. We're going to break it down. This all comes down to two key things, which is smoothness and acceleration, as far as humans are concerned with perceiving it. When we were talking to Tom about this, he made some good points. Where showing frames faster allows the brain to sort of interpolate and produce a smooth-looking, consistent series of events. That's what makes the illusion of TV and movies work. But the brain also knows how to identify acceleration really well. This is something that benchmarking generally doesn't have a good metric for. That's what we're trying to solve. Tom equated this to, I'm going to quote him because I can't say it any better, quote, back to monkey times like running away from lions and shit. End quote. I don't think he meant like running away from shit. I think he meant like... This is an example of animation error that we created in 3D space, something Andrew made on the team. It's very smooth and accurate as a rate, but it's slow. Every now and then you'll see an error in it despite the smoothness of the frames, and that's stutter. When the brain sees even subtle acceleration or deceleration, we pick it up pretty quick. That's what makes it feel so bad when we see stutter in gaming. Stutter is what you're seeing here. Something accelerates or decelerates quickly, and the body is overreacting because, to quote Tom, quote, we really don't want to be eaten by a lion or some shit like that, end quote. He really has a gift. Smoothness is already measured pretty well with frame-to-frame intervals and what we often call frame time pacing, the sort of consistent perception of how the frames are presented to you as the player. But what we as an industry haven't done a good job at is quantifying the acceleration, and animation error characterizes that. So we're going to preview the first full charts for that now. We'll get into it more throughout this video. This chart is from our Dragon's Dogma 2 testing at launch, where we were quietly beginning to farm data for this eventual piece. You can see where the animation error blips often align with frame time spikes, but not always, and that's the key. Animation error can also be positive or negative. When a frame is displayed too late relative to its correct placement, that's a negative error. And when it's shown too soon, that's a positive error. Neither is good. At a macro level, it doesn't matter which is which. Further away from zero is always worse. The idea is that if frames are created at a certain pace, they should also be displayed at that same pace. But this isn't necessarily the same thing as frame time pacing. It kind of sounds like it, and that's part of the confusion here. But there is a distinction. If there's a mismatch between the creation and display of the frames, that's where animation comes in, where movement depicted in the frames will appear jerky and wrong, even if the frame times are perfectly consistent. To make our point easier, we decided to go to the GTX 1080 Ti. And actually, to really make the point, we decided to use two of them in SLI. Yeah, we know. The point of this is that we can take one GPU for normal animation error, and then we can take two of them in SLI combined to create worse animation error. And this approach should allow us to at least prove the concept. We're getting into benchmarks. We're going to break these benchmarks down into a few things, and we are starting with the most abstracted metric that everyone is familiar with, which is this chart. This is frame rate represented as bars, abstracting away from the base metric of time. Next, we'll look at frame times that create this frame rate average. And last, we'll look at the new animation error metric. These are averaged results for 30-second logged runs of Far Cry 5's baked-in benchmark, one using a single 1080 Ti FTW3 and one using two of EVGA's beloved 1080 Ti's in SLI. The 1% and 0.1% lows indicate that there weren't huge frame time spikes, and it's these metrics that tell us when we should inspect a frame time plot closer for major problems. Average FPS smooths over problems. 1% and 0.1% are still averages and can still smooth over them, but are more likely to draw our attention toward a problem because they're averaging the worst 1% and the worst 0.1% of data. And this is a good time too to remind everyone that we're not using percentiles for these. That's a different way of approaching this. We explained that in our video where we did Jay's 2 cents' lab overhaul. We'll link that below if you want to learn more. Anyway, the average with SLI is higher, as expected. However, beyond that, there's no dramatic change between how these numbers manifest. The single 1080 Ti appears to have closer frame time pacing, 1% and 0.1% lows, to its average FPS. This is what we've been preaching for years as a good result. But the dual 1080 Ti's still look good overall. They don't proportionally scale the lows to the average, but from here they look fine. Now just these 1% and 0.1% bars, they're not necessarily bad enough to trigger a look into frame time, so we might kind of make the comment of they're not proportional to the average and move on. But a frame time plot, if we were to pull one up, will let us look deeper into what those bars mean. Now this still is an animation error, and it's still not new. We already show these plots whenever we think hardware has a problem in a particular test. This plot of frame times is for 2 individual passes. As we know, based on the last chart, the SLI run's gap between the average and its 1% and 0.1% low metrics is wider. Here, that materializes in the form of spiky behavior, particularly in the 500 to 1000 frame range for the SLI configuration. The experience is far less consistent, with more sporadic frame time excursions from baseline. Most users begin to notice these around 8 milliseconds, according to an interview we conducted with Scott Wasson years ago, but only if they frequently occur, and only if that's the actual deviation from frame n-1. The single card run has more consistent frame times despite its lower average. It's not so bad that it's a ruinous experience, as the SLI configuration is ultimately still within the range of 2 to 4 milliseconds of the baseline, but the relative distance from baseline is larger. It's not like we're seeing 100 millisecond spikes where you'd stare at one frame for 1/10 of a second, as we've seen in other tests on modern single cards. Alright, time to get to the exciting part. This is the new stuff. The left axis shows animation error in milliseconds, with deviations away from 0 depending on whether frames showed up too soon or too late. 0 is perfect, and 0 does occur. The x-axis represents frames, the same as the frame time plot we just showed. The animation errors could also be taken as absolute values for a lower is better representation, but this is a plot of the raw data as logged by PresentMon. There are many ways this data could be plotted. A scatter plot lets us judge the data points individually, but still keeps the points in order so that we can see how behavior changes over the course of the test. Lines between the points wouldn't really mean anything here, so we didn't add them. By plotting the animation error, we can get rid of frame times as a variable and just compare that relative spikiness as a player would truly feel it interacting with the game itself. This is closer to the real experience, in the same way end-to-end latency can be, but for different reasons. The further the deviation from 0 in either direction, the worse. The cards in SLI frequently had 2 to 3 milliseconds of animation error per frame, one direction or the other, while the single card typically had well under 1 millisecond of animation error. The SLI configuration is therefore significantly worse for animation error in a relative sense, despite even the frame time data not looking that dramatic. But the key here is the word relative. We still need to look at the absolute. The single card is clearly far better in terms of animation error, although we need more data to judge whether the SLI result would be considered bad. This is another test. This time we're using Strange Brigade. Our goal today is exploratory, so we're choosing games based on usefulness to explore the concepts, not on their popularity or newness. That'll come later. The main advantage of a plot like this is that we don't have to insert our own calculations or our own conclusions. We can simply show the data. The single 1080 Ti sticks closer to 0 animation error per frame than it did in Far Cry, while the SLI 1080 Ti's continue to generate 2 to 3 milliseconds of positive or negative error on nearly every frame. Only rarely do the 1080 Ti's and SLI approach 0. SLI outperforms the single card so heavily in this title that the red line is significantly shorter, which is a downside of using frames as an x-axis. Even though its average frame rate and its lows are overall good here for the single GPU, the dual GPUs, at least in the averaging, appear to outperform it. The animation error, though, is far superior on the single GPU. There is a possibility that it feels better to a player, but not for the reasons everyone in this community, including us, has said for years. It's not due to the frame times, on a pure technicality. Instead, it's due to the animation error, which is a metric that has been under the surface this whole time. It hasn't been exposed until recently. Here's an attempt at compressing this back into a bar, which would in theory allow us to look at more cards at once. This is error per frame. Maybe this could work better as a visualization. For those two individual passes in Far Cry from earlier, the total animation error, taken as absolute values, divided by the total number of frames, was 0.13 milliseconds per frame for the single 1080 Ti and 2.31 milliseconds per frame for the SLI 1080 Ti's. These are basically single number summaries in a bar for the plots we just showed. But now we're doing the bad thing again. We're doing the thing that PCPer, Tech Report, and Tom Petersen tried to get away from, which is turning numbers into a bar abstracted away from what they really mean. And the reason people do this, again, us included, is because it's easier to understand. It provides glanceability, and you kind of lose that when you can really only fit 2 or 3 things on a scatter plot or something. It's easier to read as a bar. So this isn't ideal for a lot of reasons. Now, first of all, a chart like this could obscure individual big error spikes, if that's something we want to track. And secondly, and we think more importantly, it adds back frame rate as a variable, which we successfully eliminated from the variables by showing the scatter plot. So by doing the bars, frame rate becomes a factor again because the SLI configuration has a higher frame rate, and as a result of that, when doing averaging math that involves division against some kind of totality of the result, the amount of frames in this case, it will arguably make the SLI cards look unfairly good, just like the frame rate bar charts might do, because the SLI setup generates more frames and that lowers the end result for the calculation. Then again, maybe it's not unfairly if the new chart shows an advantage for SLI because the frames are going by quicker, and maybe that could help disguise the animation error. Okay, this is getting complicated, but maybe you can see why it took a couple years for us to even just try to start putting this into benchmarking, and why it's taken us the last several weeks to figure out how to conceptualize it and present it. So we don't like the prior chart, the bar with the millisecond averages, for those reasons. And the scatter plot, although it's good, doesn't accommodate more than 2 or 3 GPUs before it's illegible. So we need to do funny stat math things and try to find another one. Maybe this will help. This alternative was suggested by Tom last year. It divides the total animation error absolute values by the total frame times, the length of the test run, to get a ratio or a percentage. This is equivalent to comparing those average error per frame numbers from the last chart to average frame times. Now this chart could have a problem, but we already corrected for it. To make the percent chart right, we had to use 2 times the total frame times for the calculation, because otherwise the implication is that 100% is the maximum value, and it wouldn't be if we hadn't corrected for that, and that's because in the absolute worst case scenario, and assuming that latency doesn't accumulate over the course of the test run, which is a different subject entirely, the maximum total animation error would be twice the total frame time. Let me make this easier. This diagram makes that abundantly clear by showing that alternating between infinitely small frame times rounded to 0 and 10 millisecond frame times and inversing the display times, we get 10 milliseconds or minus 10 milliseconds animation error per frame, where adding up all the frame times gives us 30 milliseconds, yet adding up all the absolute values of the animation error gives us 60 milliseconds, so obviously that's the problem, but we've already solved for that in our percent chart. Okay, so it probably didn't really help with the not making it confusing. Look, the point is that we already corrected for this in our chart. Any other reviewers planning to use such a chart would need to do the same. And the other good news is no one has to understand any of this because we already did that part. We used the same 2 Far Cry passes for this example. For the single 1080 Ti, the result is 0.7% with the math we just explained. And for the SLI setup, the result is 17.3%. This potentially cancels out or reverses the high frame rate advantage from the last chart. More frames equals more total error. So this illustrates that, depending on how we choose to do the funny stat math, if we were to abstract away from the base metric, you could represent things in a way that has a different conclusion using the same data. Let's talk about some potential real-world use cases, and if you're a reviewer in the community, maybe this will give you some ideas for presentation or for utilization of this, and if it does, we'd ask that you please point back to this one if we've done anything here that's helped you, because this was an enormous amount of work to try and wrap our heads around. So animation error is theoretically decoupled from the frame rate and the frame time metrics, although in reality, poor performance often correlates across all of these categories: animation error, frame rate, and frame time. Not always, as we know from frame rate and frame time, but often. In this mock-up from Intel, the bar marked CPU stutter marks a frame time spike, while the mismatch between the sizes of the bars in the top and bottom rows is the animation error. Frame 1 versus frame 1 equals error for frame 2. Frame 2 versus frame 2 equals error for frame 3. So we'd see similar spikes in both metrics. Animation error is also separate from latency. It's about how the frames are spaced, not whether they're all showing up 10 seconds late. A frame generation is really interesting in all of this, but unfortunately, there's no animation time for fake frames. And so there's no reference against which to judge error, to calculate animation error for fake frames. And that makes this whole thing even more challenging to quantify. And we'd like to check on NVIDIA MFG in particular. That's because it comes along with flip metering, which shuffles frame timings around at the end of the pipeline and has potential to actually induce animation error, as we mentioned with the SLI example. Animation error has the potential to shine a light on flip metered frame generation that would currently be masked with existing testing methods. But we won't know until the software works on it. Which may at least be partially reliant on NVIDIA's willingness to play ball. Also, the problem with frame generation and fake frames not having a reference animation time. Because we expect animation error to correlate with frame time spikes most of the time, its most common usages for us will be similar to 0.1% lows in frame time plots, but with a more direct representation of how the game feels. For example, this is a chart that Tom helped us generate during the early stages of troubleshooting Dragon's Dogma 2 performance back when it launched. That's how long we've been thinking about this data. The spikes in both metrics line up exactly, but animation error adds depth by telling us why the stuttering was so noticeable and unpleasant. The positive and negative animation error dots that correspond to the frame time spike towards 60 milliseconds around frame 500 shows a potential for 45 milliseconds of animation error. That's potentially a lot more noticeable than even the already noticeable frame time hitch of 58 milliseconds. Here's Borderlands 2. Yeah, we know there's newer ones, but this is a better demonstration. For a lot of reasons, really. Since animation error effectively cancels out frame rate differences, we can use it to compare two completely different pieces of hardware, and we'd get more nuance out of it. These two results are from our piece about the death of 32-bit PhysX. These two particular results were fairly close together, both in terms of the average FPS and the lows. The GTX 980 with GPU PhysX averaged 101 FPS across multiple passes, and the RTX 5080 with CPU PhysX averaged 95 FPS. These are real results, and we explained them in our piece about NVIDIA killing 32-bit PhysX support earlier this year, which is interesting and you should check it out. In spite of that, there's a clear difference in behavior, and animation error is much higher with the GTX 980. Using the percentage math that we mentioned earlier, that's an error-to-frametime ratio of 11.9% for the 980 and 1.8% for the 5080, which allows us to identify a problem without having to generate frame time plots for every single result. We probably wouldn't use a test scene that resulted in a graph like the GDC 2015 one shown here by NVIDIA. But as it points out, there are scenarios like this where frame time spikes could be artificially masked and not show up in 1% and 0.1% low calculations. NVIDIA is using percentiles here instead, which we don't use, but the idea for why it could be a limitation is similar. So in this instance, assuming frame time spikes were accompanied by animation error, then animation error would do a much better job at summarizing the problem with the experience that's being shown here. Now that said, our approach to lows does help control for a little bit of this rather than going with percentiles, but it still requires knowledgeable testers to know when and how to inspect the low results. Animation error has been associated with microstutter in the past, but it's not quite the same thing. If anything, animation error is a way to measure microstutter, but it's not microstutter itself, depending on the definition. To make this make more sense, we need to go back in time to 2015, and when hardware was more affordable. Microstuttering was the biggest problem in the world back then. There were no other larger problems, as you might remember. Microstuttering was frequently brought up in the context of multi-GPU rendering, so we'll go back in time and start there by referencing materials from GDC 2015. This simplified timeline establishes our foundation. Each block is a frame, and frame n gets displayed while the computer works on frame n+1 behind the scenes. CPU work isn't represented here, but we'll ignore that for now. The frame times are perfectly consistent, which is ideal. This next slide shows how alternate frame rendering, or AFR, multi-GPU operates, or at least operated back when anyone actually supported it. Each of the GPUs takes turns rendering frames, and the output is combined and displayed in order. The blue boxes are still uniform sizes, indicating consistent display times, and they're smaller than the previous diagram, indicating a higher frame rate. One of the major difficulties with AFR is trying to synchronize GPUs. Here, GPU 0 and GPU 1 are taking the same amount of time to complete individual frames, but they're poorly synced so that some frames get little display time and are effectively wasted. These are also known as runt frames, where fractions of frames are shown in a way that elevates the average FPS, but creates an awful experience with bad tearing. The average frame rate is higher with runt frames because more frames are rendered and technically shown, even if you're seeing a sliver of it. But the additional frame is useless, it provides no value to the user, and the actual experience can look worse as a result of it and can look lower in frame rate, which is one definition of microstutter. Again, we can't see the CPU stage of the pipeline here, but we'll assume it's being completely consistent. In this example, the rhythm of animation matches the rhythm of display, so there's no animation error. The frame rate is stuttery, but all the moving stuff in the frame shows up in the right place at the right time. After each short frame time, objects move a little. After each long frame time, objects move a lot. You can avoid that microstutter by forcing the pacing into alignment. Ideally, this happens by manipulating delays early in the pipeline on the CPU, in which case you return to a clean result like this one. However, if you were to meter those frames out at the end of the pipeline, that would directly contribute to animation error, or animation stutter, as NVIDIA put it back then. We've created and rendered an edited diagram to show what that would look like. If you just take the short frames and hold on to them for longer before flipping, then there's a mismatch between the pacing of the frames as they're displayed versus the animations depicted in those frames. That leads to perceived stuttering and rubber banding. Back to our earlier animation, that's seen when comparing the red and green indicators below the scene, where the imperfect ball stalls and then gets dragged forward in uneven intervals. And right now, we're not exploring which method NVIDIA or AMD used to deal with microstutter. That's a subject for another time. And that time was 12 years ago. Today, we're just showing a real-world example of a situation where animation error was a risk. Andrew and the team made some 3D mockups of simulated animation error. We started by rendering out a scene at 120 frames per second. This could have been any arbitrary number, but picking a high frame rate allowed us to downsample and play around with the spare frames. Here's what that looks like. The top row of squares represents our 120 FPS source video, and we'll pretend that our simulated game has an impossibly low 0 latency, meaning that this row represents in-game reality. The bottom row of squares represents frames that we pulled out of the original source sequence to create our 60 frames per second video. Because we pulled exactly every other frame, we still have smooth playback with 0 frame time spikes and 0 animation error. Because also we display the frames in sync with their original placement, we have 0 latency as well. Since we're pulling frames every 16.67 milliseconds from the source video, our animation times are always 16.67 milliseconds. And since we're also displaying those frames every 16.67 milliseconds, our displayed times are always 16.67 milliseconds. Therefore, animation error is always 0. The green circle represents reality, as determined by our source video, while the red circle represents what we're actually seeing right now. Again, these match perfectly in this control example. By taking some of the spare frames from the source video, we can create animation error, but we need to be specific. The diagonal lines mean that we're taking the original frames and displaying them later than reality, which introduces latency. Latency itself is not animation error. That's a different problem. As we play through the big lump of diagonal lines at the start of this clip, the red circle falls behind the green circle, but the animation of the video remains smooth. Animation error is when the red circle jerks around, skipping to catch up with the green circle at an uneven pace. If you watch the video when this happens, you can see the interruptions. This is what we mean when we say animation error is a measurement of jitteriness. Here's an extreme example of our point about latency. We're displaying every frame 41.67 milliseconds late, so the red circle lags behind the green, but the resulting video is identical to the control. Animation times and displayed times are still perfectly matched at 16.67 millisecond intervals every time, so there's 0 animation error. We can do this multiple times during the clip to intensify that feeling of rubber banding. We're creating a lot of variation in our simulated animation times here. If we take 2 back-to-back frames from the 120 FPS source video, That's an 8.33 millisecond animation time. If we pull 2 frames that were spaced 4 apart in the original video, that's a 33.3 millisecond animation time. Meanwhile, our displayed times remain constant, because we're still displaying fresh new frames exactly 16.67 milliseconds apart. That's the mismatch in pacing that animation error quantifies. As Tom told us off camera, our challenge is to, quote, make people understand that you can take frames and show them with an even cadence on display and still have it look like shit, end quote. He has a real way with words. It's like poetry. We can also create an inverse example. Think about a flip book while we talk through this. Here, we've pulled frames from the source video at even intervals for constant simulated animation times of 33.33 milliseconds. But by displaying those frames at uneven intervals, we still create animation error. This is like drawing a perfect flipbook animation, but then failing to flip through the pages at a constant tempo. Now that's something probably a lot of us have experienced at some point. It's a weird theoretical example here because if we assume this is a case where frame times equal animation times, PresentMon would report a completely steady 30 FPS based on MS between app start. That's not the only way for animation error to manifest, though. In fact, it's pretty unlikely that you'd naturally encounter perfectly consistent displayed times with inconsistent animation times, or vice versa. A more realistic scenario is this one, which simulates CPU-based stuttering, like the diagram Intel shared with us. Here, rather than displaying a unique frame every 16.67 milliseconds, we freeze on individual frames. These are displayed time spikes, which usually correlate to frame time spikes under the hood. For each spike, we get 2 animation errors. After a frozen frame, the next frame is judged to be too late, and the frame after that is judged to be too soon. This is closer to what we've observed in actual games. But just like with latency, it's important to remember that the frame time spikes are not the same thing as animation error. You could theoretically keep freezing on frames while theoretically maintaining 0 animation error. To help explain further, let's cover a real-world example. For easier discussion, we're mostly ignoring VSync and variable refresh as we get into some capture demonstrations, so this means the monitor isn't a factor in any way. When we say frames are displayed, we mean that a flip has been signaled to the operating system, and without VSync, that flip can happen even if the monitor is in the middle of a refresh, leading to tearing. That pushes numbers logged without VSync towards the theoretical realm, but no more so than usual. For example, in our launch review, the RTX 5090 averaged a ridiculous 407 FPS in the Dawntrail benchmark at 1080p. That's a comparable performance number, independent of whatever monitor we used, and in that context, that's what we wanted, because we want percent scaling between devices. Separately, higher frame rates do correlate with lower latency, so there's value from that side as well. Today, though, we're also ignoring latency for purposes of focusing discussion. All of that said, the easiest way to actually show animation error in captured footage is with VSync to avoid tearing. If you ignore the overall drops in frame rate and focus on the movement of objects that should be smoothly traveling across the screen, you'll see them appear to change speed and jump around. That's animation error. It's most noticeable in fast panning shots with smooth tracking. The camera should be moving at a steady rate even when the frame rate drops, but it appears to hitch and rubber band, especially when played back at half speed. Animation error is separate from frame time spikes, but the two things are frequently associated, and they're both bad. We want to be careful here though, because animation error is uniquely bad when VSync is enabled, and this footage isn't representative of the non-VSynced test passes that we're about to discuss. One of the only ways we can represent those test passes in fixed frame rate capture is with an FCAT style overlay, which adds a visual indicator of where torn frames begin and end. This helps illustrate runt frames as well, and was used in Virtual Dub back in the day. That gives us an indicator of each individual frame that we're discussing without adding the complication of VSync, but it does also mean that frames may only show up as a tiny sliver of pixels. If we play back this footage slowly, you can frequently see the pattern of tearing. A new color shows up at the bottom of the bar in one frame of the capture. Then it continues from the top of the bar in the next frame of the capture. It's kind of a mess, and it's difficult to focus on one sliver of frame at a time, hence using VSync for visualization in spite of the downsides. The FCAT functionality would be more useful as part of the PresentMon overlay, which can simultaneously show a live graph of animation error. Now we're going to get really technical. We're going to drill into a bunch of specific flags and performance monitoring metrics that are used for analyzing all of this. That means this is going to be a bunch of definitions, and it will be fairly detailed. So this is mostly useful for people who are doing their own benchmarking or other reviewers, or if you're just interested in learning. But if you don't care about the definition of a bunch of specific terminology, just skip to the next timestamp. All right, so here are the present-mon CPU metrics. CPU start time in milliseconds is the moment where a new frame is born. It's expressed as a timestamp relative to the beginning of the present-mon session. Up next, we have animation time. This is present-mon's best estimate of the frozen moment in game time that's depicted by a frame. As a player, you're always seeing rendered images of a game several milliseconds after the in-game reality that they depict. Animation time is the timestamp for that reality. According to Tom Petersen last year,
so today people are mostly using CPU start as the animation time, which is a pretty good proxy, and that's what we're going to be doing initially. There are explicit APIs, both from NVIDIA and from us and others, that are allowing game engines or games to tell you that animation time. And so as that becomes more available, we'll be building that into present.
I see. Now logically, animation time should be the same as the moment the frame was born, or CPU start time in milliseconds, but games can pull tricks to smooth animation so that animation time for a frame doesn't line up with wall clock time. Under normal circumstances, it should be close enough though. As an example of an exception, present-mon can monitor sim start events when using Intel XELL and soon NVIDIA Reflex, and base animation time on that instead. That's valuable because Reflex and XELL clear the render queue and keep the CPU sitting around waiting for input until the last possible second. So there's a higher potential for differences between CPU start and the true animation time. Here we have a present-mon capture of Cyberpunk 2077. The x-axis shows individual logged frames. The y-axis is the delta between CPU start time in milliseconds and animation time for each frame. Normally, this would result in a perfectly flat line at 0, but since we have XELL enabled, animation time is based on sim start instead. With XELL, there's a significant delta between the two values on nearly every frame, which shows that animation error would be incorrect if it were based on CPU start time in milliseconds when low latency modes like XELL, Reflex, and Anti-Lag 2 are enabled. Andy's Anti-Lag 2 doesn't generate sim start events that present-mon can grab, so for now we won't be able to accurately score animation error with that feature enabled. It's fine for AMD cards, just not with Anti-Lag 2. MS CPU busy is next. This period begins at CPU start time in milliseconds and includes steps that Intel labels as game and render. Game is the time spent handling game logic and calculations for the frame, and render is the time spent converting the results into API calls, DX, Vulkan, etc. The end of these CPU-specific tasks is marked by the present call, which signals to the GPU that it has everything it needs for rendering. Future versions of present-mon may break this down further because CPU work is complex. Up next, though, is time in milliseconds. This is the timestamp of the present call that we just mentioned. It's important to remember that this call doesn't mark the beginning of the GPU rendering step because the GPU can get a head start before the CPU is done generating API calls. Usually, the end of the present call is the CPU start time in milliseconds of the next frame. Up next is millisecond between presents, which is the delta between this frame's present call, time in milliseconds, and the previous frames. In the old days, time between present calls was used as a fairly good approximation for frame times, but it's technically a different thing. For that reason, MS between presents is unusable for per-frame calculations like animation error. This is part of why the industry is moving away from it. Next is MS, or milliseconds, in present API. This is the same as MS CPU wait. This is the period between the present call and the moment when the CPU begins working on a new frame, meaning that there's nothing blocking further CPU work. MS between app start is next. present-mon's best representation of the literal time taken to create an individual frame start to finish, an improvement over MS between presents. It's the delta between the CPU starting work on one frame and the next, so the difference between CPU start time in milliseconds for the current frame and CPU start time in milliseconds for the next frame, or MS CPU busy plus MS CPU wait. Up next is MS between simulation start. This column would depend on sim start events from Reflex or XELL. In the current version of present-mon, MS between simulation start is, quote, disabled until underlying event support is enabled, end quote. Presentmon GPU metrics is next. We don't need these numbers in order to calculate animation error, but we'll go over them briefly. They include ms or milliseconds GPU time, the total GPU render period comprising GPU busy and GPU wait periods. This was formerly called ms GPU active. Also, it comprises ms GPU busy, the portion of the render period, quote, during which at least one GPU engine is executing work from the target process, end quote. ms GPU wait is the portion of the GPU render period where the GPU was idle, potentially due to some codependency on CPU resources. We have a few more to go through here. Presentmon display metrics include milliseconds until displayed, which is the time between the present call for the frame, time in milliseconds, and the time at which the frame is displayed. You can calculate the timestamp at which the frame is displayed by adding these numbers, but it isn't logged directly. Displayed here means that a flip, pointing to a new frame buffer, is signaled to the operating system. This is different from new pixels literally showing up on the physical monitor, although the timing should be very close. Milliseconds between display change is next. That's how long the previous frame was displayed before the current frame started to be displayed. There is an argument to be made that this reflects the user experience more directly than milliseconds between app start. But milliseconds between app start is directly tied to performance, so that metric is still better for testing hardware. However, since display happens at the end of the pipeline, milliseconds between display change is the only way to include post-processing stuff, such as generated frames and RTX 5000 frame metering in results if you want that. And finally, for the last few metrics, we have some combined ones. Milliseconds GPU latency is the period between the absolute start of work on the frame, CPU start time in milliseconds, and the point at which the GPU started working on it. The start of the GPU render period can be inferred from this. Milliseconds render present latency is the period from the present call at the end of CPU rendering to the end of GPU rendering. This is equal to milliseconds until displayed unless VSync is enabled. And then there's ms animation error. Here's how Intel represents the animation error formula for frame n on the screen. It involves animation time n for a different frame chronologically, and milliseconds between display change as part of the formula. Again, the result of the formula can be positive or negative, but further away from zero is always worse in either direction. Adding together all the positive and all the negative animation errors for a logging period will typically cancel out. So to get a useful total, we need to take absolute values. In the words of Tom Petersen,
and the animation step is basically equal to the frame time mostly, right? There's some times where it's a little different, but what you need that for is to be correlated with the display time step. Because if the display time step is different from the animation time step, you'll get a simulation time error, which is measuring stutter directly for the first time.
So we've established that animation time is the in-game point in time that a given frame depicts. The delta between animation times for consecutive frames is the amount of in-game time that has passed between them. We've also established that ms between display change is the time that a frame is displayed before the next one shows up. If a long time passes between taking snapshots of the game state, a long time should pass between displaying the snapshots. Even if the animation times are spiky and uneven, the displayed times should be matched exactly. Otherwise, you get animation error, which is what we're looking at today. All right, so there's a lot of information today. You're going to start seeing these charts appear. We will continue to kind of give some basics every time we show them, but we're going to point back here long term. One more quick highlight of the people working on this. So Tom Petersen kind of kicked it off. Patrick on our team worked directly with Andrew to build those animations, and the two of them were basically in charge of trying to figure out how we could make any of this make any sense to anybody, and they've done a phenomenal job on that. I'll be working to get this methodologically implemented, and I've been working on figuring out how to actually use this data to evaluate products. This does not replace the current testing. It doesn't replace frame rate. It doesn't replace average 1% or 0.1% bars, and it doesn't replace any kind of frame-to-frame interval or, as it's often been called, frame time analysis. This is similar in some ways to frame time analysis charts in that this will be most useful sort of case by case when there's a problem that we can't quite explain. This will give the answer when otherwise frame times might not have, which often is more of an issue with a game that's just built poorly or running poorly than necessarily a specific piece of hardware, but it can be both. And so that's what we're using going forward to help build upon our understanding. There's a lot of theoretical situations here. It's not always practical, but when it is, this is really important. And we're happy to have started using them about 11 years ago, and we're going to continue using them. But it's time to try and find some new metrics, and we hope animation error can supplement the 1% and 0.1% average bar representations of frame time pacing as another means to determine why a game just feels bad sometimes. But we don't want to oversell this metric either. In Tom's word, this is a, quote, how jittery am I, end quote, metric. That's basically what it's trying to do. These charts have been our main work here on and off over the last year or so, and more seriously over the past month. It's been trying to prove the concept and find a way to put it on a chart that makes sense to anybody. We devoted a lot of time today to explaining how and why this is different from numbers that we already use and measure. But in practice, and in most cases, we expect animation error to complement those numbers, not contradict them. That also means we're not necessarily expecting any huge upsets versus what we or others have already concluded in reviews. Now, it's possible that this contradicts those numbers, but it is unlikely in the testing we've done so far. That said, this is a valuable new tool that can do several other things for us. It can show us when we need to make a frame time plot more easily. It can show us when stuttering happens independently from frame time spikes, although that may be unlikely. It can sort of normalize for frame times in a way that makes comparisons between different hardware easier, and it can deal with up and down frame time trends across test passes effectively. Most importantly, animation error forces us to think about what we're doing and make us think about the metrics that we're actually collecting and analyzing, because we're now closer to discussing why stuttering feels bad and what's making it feel bad, not just that it exists. So we're still experimenting with ways to make all this useful. If you want to try it out for yourself, PresentMon is free and open source. It now has a user interface version as well. If you're a reviewer and you found this video useful in developing your own methods or your own charts in the future based on this, we'd really appreciate you pointing back here if you used any of this. We've been using PresentMon for years, and actually most people who've tested game performance have, including most of the reviewers. And users use PresentMon all the time. You often just don't know it. It's built into all kinds of stuff, like hardware info. The tool is wrapped in over half a dozen at this point software solutions that are baking PresentMon into their own interfaces, but it's PresentMon at the core. So it's pretty well distributed and used out there. This is just a new part of those metrics. We use the command line version, but there's also a user interface tool. You can see in our video we introduced to Jay previously. He's been doing a lot with it. They sometimes have different feature sets between command line and user interface. Because of that, a quick security warning though. So first of all, PresentMon is an awesome tool. You should play around with it if you haven't. You can do a lot of cool stuff with it. But more importantly, the only official source for PresentMon is GitHub and Intel.com. Intel maintains it. It's an open source utility on GitHub. There are websites out there. There's a presentmon.com we saw. We have not used it. I don't know if that is safe or not, but we know that it is not an official source. And so for security reasons, we would advise only downloading it from GitHub and from Intel.com, because the other ones are not official sources, or you can download a wrapped version from some other provider like Hardware Info or something. Testing animation error like this is exciting though, because we can finally directly score stuttering instead of simply deducing it. Big picture, this is similar to when PresentMon moved away from MS between presents. The numbers and conclusions may not change much, but the measurements are closer to what we're really talking about. All right, so this isn't the end game of benchmarking. That'd be pretty boring. Hopefully it's not. There's plenty more to discover, including with this tool. This is a research piece, just to be extremely clear. So that means we are still learning about all of this too. We are trying to start the conversation, get the ball rolling, and put this out there for the community and for other reviewers and enthusiasts to kind of experiment with and see what they can do. And hopefully it's useful. And again, if you find it useful, point back to us if you don't mind. Credit to Tom Petersen as well for starting this conversation with us to start with you all. He's an excellent engineer. He's worked at NVIDIA and Intel now. And his team has done a great job at building an open source utility and maintaining it. And now it is just up to all the other vendors to keep playing ball. So that'd be mostly NVIDIA and AMD. But so far we've got a great start. And thanks to Tom for his patience in teaching us about this. And I believe the quote was, running away from lions and shit. That was really what made it a lot easier to understand all of this. I don't know why. It was those words that I was like, oh, okay, yeah, we can do that. Anyway, subscribe for more. Please support us directly. You can go to store.gamersnexus.net to do that by grabbing one of these t-shirts. This is our Blind Eye shirt that we launched with our AI GPU black market smuggling documentary. Or you can grab one of our PC building anti-static mod mats, also on the store, or our mouse mats. coaster packs and other items. All of that supports us directly, or go to patreon.com/gamersnexus. Thanks for watching. We'll see you all next time. Check this out. Take a look at this. That right there is the animation error. Now let's talk about the animation error. Can we talk about the animation error, please? I've been dying to talk about the animation error with you all year. So I say to myself, I gotta find this metric. I gotta figure out how to quantify this. I gotta figure out how to put these numbers on the reviews. Goddamn charts. Otherwise, you all are gonna keep talking about stutters and hitching, and you're never gonna see the data. So I put the numbers on the charts, and what do I find out, Vitaly? What do I find out? There is no frame time problems. The frame time problems don't exist, okay? But they're stuttering. So I figure, oh shit, buddy. Okay, I gotta dig a little deeper. There's no frame time problem. You gotta be kidding me. I got boxes full of frame time problems. And then I realized it. Animation error. It's been there the whole time. Tom Petersen told us about animation error, but no one believed him. No one could find it. But we found it. We found the animation error.